Alrighty, I'm gonna start again. Beep. Father Matthew Buterbaugh, located
Yes.
in Wisconsin, close to Chicago. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining our third interview of this show called Who's Calling? And it's all about your calling to serve, right?
Yeah.
Um, so why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I am an Episcopal priest. I was trying to think about, we were talking a little bit before the interview. You'd asked to hear a little bit about my own background. So I grew up in the Episcopal Church, in a small town in Kansas, real small church as well. And the Episcopal Church, even in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, uh, was a little bit more of the progressive end of Christian denominations, although certainly have some variety. Um, I actually think quite fondly of the church I grew up in, and I always think quite fondly of it. I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics in the way the little church, that I went to every single Sunday formed me. My parents were very involved. And actually, my mom was very involved until she passed away about a year and a half ago. My dad is still really involved with church. My dad, I mean, he's been on the vestry, which is like their parish council. He's been on, he's served at the altar, help assisting. So my mom was in the choir. She was a reader, so they were always involved. My mom did led youth group and things like that. So that was a lot of my just growing up. It was very involved in church. Would we travel? We always went to church when we traveled, tried a new church. And we kind of were a little bit brand specific in that we'd always find the local Episcopal church, or if we were traveling abroad, an Anglican church, which is part of the same denomination. Um, yeah, with that said, and a lot of people, I always hear stories about people who grew up in church too, and then like had this moment of like everything came down when, fill in the blank thing happened, that this didn't work out for me. And I really never had that. I think one of the things just growing up in a pretty affirming environment in a lot of ways has really kept me where I am now. That said, so when I was in grade school, I did go to a private school. It was a Missouri Synod Lutheran grade school, so I have a little commonality there. I went there from kindergarten through fourth grade, and I would say that was another interesting thing because um, it really gave me a lot of scriptural and religious background in some ways that I have appreciated into my adulthood. There were some things that just being a different tradition than my own. So, it was all the other kids in school were going, well, not all, but most of the kids in my school were going to the local LCMS church, and I went to the Episcopal church, and maybe one or two others were going to other churches. But that was kind of always an interesting tension, just to try to figure out, especially when you're young. All right, what things are things that are part of my tradition, what things are part of this tradition, and what things are we doing in common? And I remember it always being a little bit of a tension. Um, but then when I was older, I went to a public school, and so so that was kind of my background, I guess. Kind of where I came from, where I grew up. When I was in college, I attended not initially, but eventually I attended the campus ministry. I went to Oklahoma State. And Yeah, and then that was, yet another formation. I should probably also mention I was really involved with things too in the broader church, even as a kid. So I went to camp with kids from around the state. I went to some national events and things like that too. So, and I did through college as well. So,
So yeah, heavy background, but was there a time or a moment where you knew, you had to decide what to do and you knew that this was your path or your calling?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So when I was all throughout my childhood and up through college, I had wanted to be an architect. Part of that was I just always liked doing kind of craftsy things. So I had an uncle who was a carpenter and I used to help him out all the time. And so I always really enjoyed that sort of building aspect of it. And I always liked drawing and things like that. Funny story is though I was terrible at math, which is what ended up eating my lunch at the end. Um, you know, so um, yeah, I went to so I mentioned I went to Oklahoma State partly because they had one of the top architecture schools in the country. And so the way it kind of works or worked, I don't think it does there anymore. Well, it might, but the way it worked at that time was you would do 2 years of pretty intensive work in the architecture program, and then they only took 30 students into the third year. So there was kind of a cutoff, and so half the students would get cut off at that point. So I got to the end of my second year. And again, I did pretty good with the studio stuff, but I mean, calculus was eating my lunch, those kind of things. So I applied. I did not make the cut. So I went back and I retook some classes just to try to boost my GPA a little bit. And I think that third year, which was kind of a repeat of some of my second year. I mean, retaking some math. I retook the studio just to keep in the program. Um, I was starting to have a lot of wonderings about it. And so that the first summer, no, sorry, the second summer in college, so between my second and third year, I had an internship working for housing and urban development. And that was actually kind of cool. I mean, working on public housing projects. Well, not like big projects, they were like individual houses, but and then between my next 2 years, I had an internship at a private architecture firm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I kind of remember toward the end of that third year, before I started this internship, I was talking to my priest who uh, um, who had the funny distinction of being Mother Mary, which was always kind of funny. But and I said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm applying for this third year again in the second time around, and I really don't know. Um, I don't know if I'll get in. I don't know if and I said, at the same time, I'm kind of wondering maybe I would, try a different major like history. And I said, but I don't know what I would do with history. And she said, yes, you do, Matthew. You would become a priest. And it was funny because in the back of my head, I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I had never said it out loud. Um, so I I yeah, had that internship that summer, and it turns out I did not get into the program again. And at that point, I just decided, this is not going to work. So, I mean, this is kind of second time around, and so I actually remember talking to my mom at some point, and I said I may change to history, and she said, "Oh no, you're going to become a priest, aren't you?" Never said a word to her. So, um, anyway, so I had this internship, and it was actually going fine. I mean, I was pretty good with the drafting part of it. But I, yeah, I remember going back. So it was about an hour or so away from where I was at college. So I remember one day I took off work. Actually, funny story was I had a speeding ticket. Uh, and that was the court date. So I had just taken off work to go to court. Well, I decided to just say, forget it. It wasn't that big of a ticket. Paid the ticket, but I already taken the day off. So I drove back to my college town. I walked into the architecture department and I said, I'm changing my major. What do I do? And somebody reaches into, and I mean, this is almost the funniest thing because this was like early 2000s. What was this about? 2001 maybe? Yeah, I think it was like summer 2001. Um, but just to think how like different things are in 25 years. The woman at the front desk pulls open this giant file cabinet drawer, goes through the files. She pulls out this big fat file folder that had my name on it. She hands it to me. She said, walk this over to the history department. It's in this building, in this office. And I just remember walking across campus, and it was just like the strangest feeling. Like the whole thing, everything I had always wanted to do. And it was just this like weird little pilgrimage across campus, this 10-minute walk or whatever it was, carrying my file folder over to the history department and then handing it in and said, Hi, I'm changing my major. Here is my folder. And somebody took my folder, pulled out a big file cabinet drawer, plopped it in, shut the drawer. It was just the strangest way, experience. So I go back at that. I was actually renting an apartment that summer. And I went back and it was like this whole just surreal day. That whole experience felt so surreal to me because it was like, here's my old path, here's my new path. And I'm still like really not sure what I'm going to do with my life, right? I mean, I had a couple of those suggestions. I've been having this thought. I think I even remember like kind of wrestling with God about this, and thinking in my mind. And I don't know whether this is like one of those like God actually talking to me or just my mind doing what my mind is doing. And I always hear people say, "Well, God said to me this, that, or the other," and I'm like, yeah, maybe. But I remember at some point having this thought about, yeah, but God, maybe I could be building churches, being an architect, and I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll build churches in another way. Um, so anyway, get back to my apartment that night, and I just checked my email. I just thought about it and checked my email. Uh, so opened up my computer, you know, plugged it into the phone line, because this was, 2001 and, when robots were still screaming at you when you logged on. Um, and a couple days before, I had this friend in high school who had sent me a chain email. It was the day before social media. So sent me a chain email. It was this god awful poem. It was horrible. And it's like something like I told him my name, and it was this teenager at the gates of heaven, and like St. Peter says, well, you're not in the book of life, and therefore you have to go to hell because you didn't lead a good life, and how awful hell was, and this whole poem, and it was terrible. And I never did this, but like this was again a few days prior, right? But I had this like bug in my ear at that point, and I was like, "This is horrible." And I hit reply. I accidentally hit reply all, um, because I responded to her, and I was like, "This is terrible." Like, if you are a Christian because you want to save yourself from hell, that is a selfish reason to be a Christian. Like being a Christian is about being selfless and emptying yourself, and if you're going to be somebody of faith, then that this is not how you should be approaching it. Anyway, I had kind of forgotten about it because all this other stuff had happened. So I get home, checking my email, And remember, I'd hit reply all. Somebody replied back to me and said, I don't know who you are, but you are an angel from God. If you're not a minister, you really should be. And it just like blew me away. It was just that was like, wow, okay, maybe even God can use electronic medium. Uh,
Direct.
yeah. So, yeah, anyway, that was kind of how I ended up where, at least my initial call story, where I ended up. Eventually I ended up in what we call a discernment process, where your parish has to sponsor you, and then you go to seminary and do all those things. Yeah, one other thing just about me is I between college and seminary, I ended up doing mission work. I was a missionary in Venezuela for a year between the time. So that has also been a pretty formative experience in my life.
Yeah, very cool. I do want to back up. I've got at least one question.
Hmm.
Um, take me back to the time when you were, still deciding to switch majors, and you brought it up a little bit, but let's dig into what was your prayer habits like? What was your prayer life like? Can you describe
Mm,
that?
boy, that's a good question. I think I tried a lot of things. I think I tried to do, this was another funny just moment in time. I've seen memes about this now that like, you remember there was that 2 weeks when everyone was into Gregorian chant and no one today will think, if you're joking or not. But it was true, right? Like, and there's a whole weird story behind that there was a record label that had to purge a bunch of like, uh, that had done recordings of this monastery in Spain and like had to purge it, so they made like these albums really cheap, and then all of a sudden like Gregorian chant just took off, like, and so anyway, um so that was like in the late 90s, like around 98, 99 or so. But so I actually remember a lot of, I tried a few things, and one of them I remember I did a lot of was I would just like put on earphones and listen to Gregorian chant because it was like a thing then, right? And just listen to it and just kind of quiet my mind, which I've always had struggled with quieting my mind. But I would say a lot of my prayer life has been, I mean, it's changed somewhat over time, but I think at that point it was a lot of just trying to talk at God and trying to see what sticks, what feels right, what doesn't feel right, where trying to, it was almost like processing out with a therapist who's very quiet. Uh, and um, but at the same time, I was always pretty active in worship life. And I think for me, and this is still true of me, that the most meaningful prayer for me is always corporate worship. The thing that I get the most out of, that I feel closest to God, that I feel uh, more transcendent in any way, is those times when uh, I am in public prayer, in group worship, and it was a pretty big part of my time in college as well, to be part of campus ministry and to have other students who were working through their faith life. But as Episcopalians, we don't really talk about our faith life in that way. Like we don't use the terms you would often think Christians do. We talk about it without talking about it, which is this kind of funny church cultural thing. I find Episcopalians are incredibly deeply spiritual, but take very seriously that when you pray, close your door so that only God hears you. And I think Episcopalians are very much like that, even around each other. We just don't talk about God much. Um, and yet, there is something very deeply spiritual about being around other Episcopalians, even when they're not talking about God, because you kind of get a sense that they don't need to talk about God because they've kind of just absorbed it in a way. And So I have always found those kinds of things, having Christian community around me, having worship life, it's just always been incredibly important to me. Um, and so I think in those times when I was really wrestling through that, being in a community of faith really was what where my prayer life was and still is even today.
Alrighty, I've got a lot of questions.
All right, let's hear it.
Let's start with well, I really want to talk about what you said there about um other Episcopalians really not talking about their faith life because they've already absorbed it. Can you elaborate on that? What does that mean?
Oh my gosh. So this was actually recent, maybe about a month or so ago. I ran across this YouTube video and it was this guy, it was why I hate the Episcopal Church. And I started watching and it was probably about 15, 20-minute video. It was really interesting to watch this because this guy he visits an Episcopal church, he's an atheist, and he's like he visits churches just to like talk about how much he hates the experience. And, and he goes to this Episcopal church and he's like, no one here talks about Jesus. But he starts to like really like you could just start seeing cracks in his like in the walls he's put up because he's talking about like no one, he has all these it just happens to be at this church where it's a senior high school senior Sunday and then these students are talking about their what church meant to them and he's like not one of them mentioned Jesus and he's like but they don't need to because you can tell that they're real. And I always feel like that is part of the church culture. Look, every church culture is different, and I don't think that this is uh, there is no wrong thing about talking about faith in a public way. And in some ways, I wish we would more, but I think in the church culture that I have grown up in, I still part of, um, there's a real value of authenticity. And when people will talk about Jesus in a way, it really needs to be authentic. It needs to come from a real like not just giving lip service to the idea of Jesus, but like if you can't show you are a person of faith, then why would you talk about it? You know, if you're not showing up, if you're not volunteering, if you're not participating in worship or doing all the good works that God has called us to do, what's the point of talking about Jesus? I mean, if you, there was a, in the fourth century, Saint uh, uh, Athanasius, no, sorry, was it Athanasius? Oh, it was John Chrysostom. That's who it was. Sorry, I blanked out for a sec. Said, if you cannot see Jesus in the beggar at the door, then you will never find Jesus in the chalice and the bread. And I think in a lot of ways that is, in my tradition, a lot of the way that we understand things is like there is a balance, right? You have to have this sense of like, we're kind of formed as Episcopalians. We're formed in almost a Benedictine kind of tradition. But like it's not just a Benedictine, but then it's also like going back prior, well, and historically, in England there was even the Celtic monastic tradition. So we have these heavy community traditions, and we have a very heavy service tradition. And I think a lot of just kind of if you grab 10 Episcopalians and put them in a room, they'll talk about all the kinds of things that one would do as a person of faith without ever actually mentioning Jesus. Not that we don't believe in Jesus, because we do, but I think what we also, but and also we tend to believe in a Jesus that is so incarnate that Jesus is present in all of the like the everyday ways, in the beggar at the door, uh in the sacraments, in the community with one another, that those are the real tangible ways. Um, so I don't know if that answers the question or just made it even more nebulous, but uh,
It brought up more questions, but I want to go back to another one that popped up. You mentioned earlier that when you pray, now this is getting back to prayer,
mhm.
that you try to quiet the mind. Does that tie into, what you just said too? How would you talk about that or why?
I think that for me is just a personal issue. I think I have a very noisy mind. So I wouldn't say that that is particularly a tradition issue, as much as it's just, this is how Matthew's brain works, and sometimes quieting my mind is a real challenge. I've always been impressed with people who can go to like, you know, go into meditation and just think about nothing, because I'm like, how does that even happen? I can't. So I think that's just more of a me thing.
Gotcha. But why is that helpful for prayer?
Um, I would say for some people, it probably isn't for me. I think that's where I was in the particular phase I was talking about. Um, I I would say for a lot of people, quieting the mind is a really good way to really be open to hearing God's word and God's call, and to finding those still moments where God is deeply present. Um, if I'm and the way it often can be explained is, if when I'm praying, I'm talking, 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 then at some point I need to close my mouth and open my ears so that I can be open for God to speak back. And so I think that, and I think that works for a lot of people. I don't know that that works for me, but I think that works for a lot of people.
There was a lot of themes so far of like God's will be done, especially when you were changing your major. Is that true? When you pray, what are you trying to listen for?
Oof. Yeah. I would love to know what God's will is. Sometimes it's really hard. Um, I think I still struggle with that. Yes, I mean, it absolutely is a God's will be done. Um, and, I have, as an adult, really gotten kind of interested in Ignatian spirituality. So, sort of the spirituality of Ignatius Loyola that has been carried out through the Roman Catholic Jesuits. And a lot of Ignatian spirituality is very much about listening. Now, it also understands that, and this is not where I was, say, 25 years ago, but, I think a lot of listening also is trying to tap into our deep desires, and then trying to parse out which desires are godly desires, and which desires are just random desires, and which desires are ungodly desires. And so trying to figure out God's will, a lot of it comes out of the inner stirring that we have inside of us. And so uh, I would say that it is a challenge, but I think there are some tools in that don't necessarily for everyone have to be about the quiet, the quietness and waiting for God to say something. Because we are all different. I mean, if you've experienced talking to different people of different traditions, um, we all are just so different, and God understands the diversity of creation that God has made. And so I think one for me, I find it's much easier to find God's will partly in parsing out my own desires, partly in still listening through scripture, through fellowship of other people. Um, I'm a little more skeptical of signs and wonders now than I was 25 years ago, but I'm not totally shelving those either.
Well, let's talk about the inner stirring and remember kind of the purpose of the show. Let's say someone is feeling an inner stirring themselves. How would you advise them or guide them through understanding what's even going on, you know?
Hmm. Well, I will say that one of the things a lot of clergy, and I don't like this, but I'm pointing this out, a lot of clergy, if say, and I assume what you mean is like, say somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I wonder if I'm called to ministry," right? I mean, it's kind of in that vein. I mean, is that I assume what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, yeah. How would you guide someone through, what if they prayed and asked, what God's will was for them and they started down this path of trying to figure out what God wants them to do. What advice could you give them?
Right. So, okay. Yeah, I think a lot of clergy can be super cynical. And will be like, run, do anything you can. That's not this. And I always kind of hate that. In fact, if you remember the movie Keeping the Faith, the Ed Norton's character, the priest, actually kind of debunks this notion really well. Or no, it wasn't Ed Norton, it's the older priest in the movie who said, that's all nonsense. It just makes us feel like superheroes. And I think it was a spot on point. Um, but I have had this happen many times, and I have mentored many people who have been discerning ministry. Um, a couple folks ended up discerning other paths in life, and several folks that I have mentored are now ordained and are in active ministry. Um, I think one of the things is, if somebody comes to me and says, I feel a call, I want to believe them. Um, and I want to support them. I don't feel like it is my job to be a gatekeeper. It's not my job to put roadblocks in front of somebody. It's not my job to to try to dissuade somebody. It is my job to support somebody in that journey. And there are various ways one can support, but I mean, getting it outside of the sort of technical nuts and bolts ways of supporting, I think the biggest thing is, uh, in my tradition, we would say that all baptized Christians are ministers of the church. And so, by virtue of your baptism at some point in your life, you are a minister of the church. You don't have to have the collar or a stole or a fancy title, but you are a minister. And so one of the things I want to do with people who come to me and say, I am discerning ministry is I really want to say, I want to support them to help them understand what that ministry looks like. Because I am already just going to come at this, the understanding you are a minister. So we're putting that one out there and putting that aside. This is not a weed out. Uh, but how does that manifest? And most people probably by the time they have come to me either know what they are called to. They don't take these decisions lightly, I mean, most people, or it might start a journey that leads them somewhere that helps them find what their ministry is. And so, sometimes people will come and say, well, maybe I could be a deacon. And then they find that, maybe it was really the priesthood that was really calling them, or I want to be a priest, but it turns out actually maybe I am just called to some ministry within the church that is really a lay specific ministry. But I think the biggest thing for me is I'm there as your mentor, your friend, and your support system. And I mean, I'll go to hell and back for people to help them find that ministry. And I've really gone to bat for people sometimes, where, sometimes they'll get into some of the institutional stuff and somebody will say, "Well, I don't know." And then I have to remind these institutional folks, it's not your job you're not the gatekeeper. You are a discerner. And a discerner is trying to find a path, not trying to say yes or no. And I think that's really where, and if I could give any criticism to the church, and particularly I know this through my own denomination, is we really need to be discerners. We need to understand if someone is called, that everybody is called to something. And our job is to help find them or help them discover what that is they are called to.
Do you ever do that in a way that helps them understand, like in let's say in prayer, they're having a hard time understanding what's their own thoughts and made up versus what might actually be God trying to send them, an email.
Right.
Uh,
Um, yes, I mean, absolutely. I think a lot of it is just try stuff on. I mean, it's like you go buy clothes, right? I mean, I realize as men we don't do this as much, but I'll just buy it on the shelf, and if I don't like it, I'll donate it or something. But you're right, okay, but like really, you go buy clothes, you try it on, you see if it fits. Well, okay, this shirt's a little baggy. Oh, well, I don't like how it works around my arms, or I like the style of pants, but it just looks weird when I put it on, and all these things. See, so when somebody is discerning their ministry, I think it's really helpful to just try stuff on, you know? All right, let's try this. I'm going to help you write a sermon. And then you're going to preach it in front of all these people and see how that feels. All right, the first time is never going to go well, but you tried it. Why don't you lead a Bible study? Tell me how that works. Tell me what that feels like. Have you uh have you had a spiritual conversation with a friend and help them work through something? What would you think about taking communion to an older person who's shut in and can't get out but needs company? So try a few things on here and there. See how that feels. Tell me about that. Did that did this feel right for you? Did this not feel right? What didn't feel good about it? Do you think there's parts of it that you could learn to love? Do you think that there's parts of this that could fit into your ministry even if it's not your thing? So just those are the ways you can guide people. And um, so, it's not always just about can you be quiet enough for God to have a loud booming voice? It's about really understanding how things feel and fit.
do you ever ask, like in the day, right now, minute by minute, hour by hour, are you asking God for guidance
All
on
the
on
time. Yeah, yeah, of course. Constantly. Um, I had a professor in seminary, it was a pastoral care class, who said something to the effect of when you go visit somebody in a pastoral setting, whatever that might look like, prayer is not optional. Now, prayer out loud is. And I've carried that line with me forever because I just think about just that moment before I write a sermon of, hey, God, what's this gonna say? And it doesn't make it easy. Sometimes it's gonna be a real slog through it. Sometimes it just comes out real easily. You never know. But or what, if I'm gonna, I just gave last rites to somebody a couple days ago, and in fact, I'm doing his funeral this afternoon. Um, and it actually started off with a conversation with the now widow, but he was still living at the time, and she wanted to just sit down and talk to me about, her husband as he's getting ready to go on to Jesus, and the conversation turned into, yeah, I think he's actively dying, so we better go and say our final goodbyes to him. But you enter those conversations, there's a certain openness you really have to have, and I think even if I forget to ask God, I think there's still a prayerful walk or a prayerful way of approaching it, even uh even if you're not using words. A prayer doesn't have to be spoken. It can be a lot of things. The catechism in our church says prayer is responding to God with or without words. And so sometimes we have to remember too that God is initiating all of these things in our life. And uh, whether we remember to say something or mentally put something out in there, out into the atmosphere, we're still being prayerful because everything we're doing is responding to God.
Mm. So God's initiating, we're responding. You're asking for guidance on how to respond
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah. How to respond or just yeah, how to respond and just in the whole aspect of my ministry is a way of responding to God. I mean, when I go into a hospital room, I don't know. I mean, I never know what I'm going to walk into. Um, Sometimes, like I said, sometimes I think, all right, God, you know, whatever you have happen here, be present. Sometimes I don't think about it. Sometimes I just walk in, but God's always doing something. And I, as a Christian, as a clergy person, as a pastor, I have to walk in and respond to whatever God's doing. Uh, sometimes it's joyful. Sometimes sometimes it's heartbreaking. Sometimes it's very holy. I mean, in speaking of, I I think one of the holiest moments, the holiest moments I have ever had as a priest have been with people when they die. And I've been with many people as they've died. Um, it sounds odd, but man, that's a privilege to be there in that moment when somebody passes from this world into eternal life. I can't describe it. And not that I want to see anybody die, of course. I mean, that's not, but it's life and to be with someone as it happens is just that is an indescribable experience. And talk about responding to God. I mean, that's where I can probably respond to God in awe and wonder.
Beautiful. So, well, thank you so much for sharing. We should probably wrap it up time-wise.
Sure.
I'm really enjoying what we're talking about. Thank you for all this.
No,
I want to ask you before we finish. I actually want to ask you one more question. Do you have any
sure.
advice, just to wrap things up on, what's your strategy for staying present? Um, and being in the moment and able to respond uh, uh, the way that feels right, right? What's your strategy for that?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I haven't thought about what my strategy is. I'm an extrovert, and so I do tend to be a little more intuitive around, emotions and personal interactions. I'm not always present. I mean, it's hard. I've had moments where I'm standing behind the altar and I'm saying the Eucharistic prayer, and I've gone from the Lord be with you to Amen, and I realize I have no idea what has come out of my mouth for the last 10 minutes. I mean, it happens. I've had other moments where I'm like, man, this is real present stuff, and it just I don't know. I mean, I think it's impossible to be always present. We're human. We can't we can't force ourselves to we can't force ourselves to always be step by step in line with God. But you know what? God's grace and mercy still abounds.
Alrighty. So to conclude here, I got one question. Is there anything you want to share with everybody who might be watching? The services you offer, how to contact you, any special projects you're working on, anything you want to raise awareness
Sure.
of, or anything like that?
Sure. I think you found me through Spiritual Directors International. I do spiritual direction. I also do some consulting for Congregate, which is actually very related. It's a little bit more like taking spiritual direction to a group level. So those kind of things I really enjoy doing. Big part of my ministry, and yeah, and yeah, just thank you for reaching out to me and letting me be a little vulnerable and telling my story.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate all the insights here. I'll have your contact info too, like in the video, so people can reach out. Go from there.
Thank you.
I'm gonna do
All right.
the edit, cut, stop here.